and welcome back to my channel. I'm carrying on reviewing Naming Adult Autism, Culture, Science and Identity by James McGrath, carrying on from where I finished off in last week's video because I've got a lot to say about this book. So now then, on page 53 of the book, James McGrath brings up the book Neurotribes. I don't know if any of you have read Neurotribes. It's by Steve Silberman. I've read it quite a long time ago now, so I can't really remember too much of what I read from it, but it's like meant to be one of the main sort of seminal autism texts of recent years. That's Neurotribes. Now, Neurotribes kind of covers the whole history of autism, and it's quite an interesting book actually. But James McGrath argues that Neurotribes reinforces the equations of autism with STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths, as popularised by Steve Silberman's own Geek Syndrome piece written in 2001, because the author of Neurotribes, the journalist Steve Silberman, back in 2001, he wrote an article in Wired magazine, which is like a sort of science magazine, called Geek Syndrome, looking at, I think it's looking at the prevalence of autism in the Silicon Valley in America. I don't know if any of you have read that article, but it basically suggests that physicists in the past were autistic, and adds McGrath argues adds to the sort of stereotype of autistics basically just being kind of nerds and geeks into kind of sciencey areas. That sort of stereotype of autism being a sort of a set of geeky quirks, which can be quite harmful potentially. So he's a little bit critical of Neurotribes there. He also mentions, but also interestingly, he looks at the intense appeal of science fiction to some autistic readers, and that's also outlined in Neurotribes as well. And this is a little bit ironic, that science fiction is a genre of literature that has often been derided for involving excessive imagination, and yet it seems to be a genre that often appeals to quite a number of autistic people, even though autistics are often said to lack sort of creative imagination. That's obviously a stereotype because, as mentioned in the previous video, it's not imagination per se that autistic people struggle with, it's the social imagination that they struggle with. But in the sort of the way that autism is often represented, there's this implication that autistics don't enjoy or fiction in general, or sort of broader sense, but this kind of doesn't quite integrate itself with the fact that that many autistics are really into science fiction, the science fiction genre, which is noted for being extremely imaginative. And there's also the suggestion that the reason why quite a few autistic people enjoy science fiction is because it chimes with some of the autistic experiences of loneliness and separation, because obviously science fiction often looks at otherworldly realms where autistics might kind of relate to. Personally speaking, I've never really been that into science fiction. I mean, I will read it if it's good, and I have enjoyed some science fiction novels that I've read, but I'm not really into it. But it is quite a common autistic kind of special interest. Also, something else that kind of conflicts with the idea that autistics by nature don't enjoy fiction at all is the fact that on quite a number of forums, autistics do show critical literary agency. For example, James McGrath cites the Wrong Planet forum, which is one of the main autism forums. That's Wrong Planet. There's quite a number of critical reviews of autistic fiction on there by autistics. So autistics will be discussing literature on there, which goes against the idea that autistics don't enjoy fiction. So there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and you just need to go and look at the forums, really, and what's actually happening on online spaces to actually know that many autistics do enjoy fiction and will talk about fiction and are really interested in fiction. I actually know, I have come across a number of autistics from various groups that I've been to who are really interested in fiction, some of them to the point of having it as their special interest, and who know a lot about fiction. So it's a complete and utter load of crap that autistics as a group don't enjoy fiction just because they're autistic, as it were, because it all depends on the individual. But as I said in my previous videos, there is a grain of truth, because all stereotypes contain a grain of truth, because of struggling with like theory of mind and stuff like that, it can make it harder to understand fiction for some, not all, but for some autistic people, because of the nature of the theory of mind difficulties, it can then make it harder to understand fiction, particularly in childhood. And when I was a kid, as I've mentioned in my other videos, I really struggled to understand the plot in fiction, to follow the plot, to know what was going on, to understand characters' intentions. And I still struggle with this as an adult, but I've developed better strategies now to try and learn about it, and obviously I have more knowledge than when I was a kid, and my comprehension is not as impaired as it was when I was a kid. It's come on a lot because you do develop, but I've had to kind of, in a sense, train myself to try and understand fiction. It helped that my dad was an English teacher, so he could give me lots of sort of instruction in that area, but I did really struggle at school with understanding the sort of hidden symbolism, the metaphors and all of that in fiction, and I'm a lot better now because I've had a lot of instruction in that area, but I've had to really focus on it and learn it, and but yeah, I'm a lot better, I've a lot improved. It's just I've had to learn it very explicitly. So that idea that autistics can struggle with fiction definitely contains a grain of truth, but it's a big leap from that to suppose that just because you're autistic, you're not going to have any appreciation for fiction, and that is just simply not the case, as has been shown by the fact that a number of autistics have fiction, or a particular type of fiction, as their very intense special interest. Science fiction is a common one, as McGrath mentions. Moving on to just turn over here. So pages. Oh yes, and the other, something else that I think that was very interesting, and that McGrath brought up in his book, is just pure coincidence. But the word SystSTEMizing, which is what autistics are said to be good at, SystSTEMizing, contains within it the word STEM, SystSTEMizing. And obviously STEM, science, technology, engineering, maths, are the subjects that autistics are said to be good at or interested in, and obviously that's a massive stereotype, which again might contain a grain of truth, because these are very fact-driven subjects, and for some autistics, if you do struggle to understand fiction because you lack the comprehension, instead of trying to work it out and trying to understand it and things like that, or developing a belated interest in it through overt analysis, that instead might completely put them off fiction. So some autistics then might fulfill that stereotype but go into those areas, those really fact-driven areas. So it's a stereotype that contains a grain of truth, it's just not the whole story, and it's certainly by no means the case that just because you're autistic you're going to be good at or interested in STEM. But it's just interesting that the word STEM is contained within SystSTEMizing. So a coincidence that it contains the acronym for science, technology and engineering and maths within it, and I thought that's quite an interesting thing that James McGrath pointed out. As he points out, it detracts from the recognition and appreciation that many other autistics can and do have valuable strengths in wider areas, including the arts and humanities. But interestingly, McGrath emphasises as well that all academic work depends to some degree on systemizing, and systemizing is the drive to analyse or construct a system, and it's anything that follows rules. So systemizing can be applied to the study and the creation of literature. For example, a sonnet. A sonnet adheres to different system of rules and patterns. Poetry is a system of tradition and experiment. So so things like poetry, art, and all these things that aren't usually included under systemizing, according to Simon Baron-Cohen's argument, do actually involve systemizing. In actual fact, pretty much any area of human study can involve systemizing. And yet, they always just focus on the STEM subjects. I mean, even things such as like child rearing. I mean, like, say if your special interest happens to be, as mine was, babies when I was growing up and looking after babies. That is a whole science, a whole area of how do you look after a baby. The sort of systemizing of, all of that kind of looking after a baby. I mean, obviously, like, people would argue, wouldn't they, that you need to have a human factor there and all that sort of feely stuff. And obviously, as an autistic person, that sort of doesn't interest me, and I'm not good at it. But the whole kind of like systemizing aspect of like looking after a baby, which doesn't involve feelings and things like that, but involves rules, that I found that really, really interesting. And and there are lots of things that aren't stereotypically considered to be autistic, or because often the things that are stereotypically considered to be autistic are kind of male gendered, and the male gendered things tend to be in those sort of STEM areas. But if you think about some of the females, and I'm talking about here female in inverted commas, because this is just like how society genders things that are actually shouldn't be gendered but have been gendered by society. So there are other areas that females might be interested in. But anyone can be interested in them, men or women. It's just they happen to be gendered by society as more female. So things such as like cooking, the sort of homemaking, knitting, stuff like that. These also involve systemizing as well. And I just thought it was really interesting that McGrath drew attention to that. So when Simon Baron-Cohen kind of like in his sort of very sort of binary way, kind of just equates systemizing with these very historically sort of male things, he's overlooking the fact that actually women, who he says aren't so good at systemizing in average, actually do a lot of systemizing in those more female gendered areas that were historically coded as feminine, but actually these areas do involve systemizing. So yeah, and also, of course, those areas that are traditionally considered to involve more systemizing, such as the STEM subjects, in order to be good at them, you do also need to, it's also an art as well, isn't it? It's an art, not just a science. So when you're doing science, you need to also be creative, you need to also be imaginative, just as when you're doing those more, just as when you're doing more quote-unquote creative subjects like art and stuff like that, you also need to have an appreciation and awareness of the rules of a discipline. So it's a complete and utterly false binary to kind of put systemizing and creative activities as kind of dual opposites, when any endeavour involves a degree of systemizing and imagination. And also he mentions, language is a system. So, language, creative writing, that's a system. You have to learn a system for it. And also, of course, he mentions out the sort of pernicious fact that Simon Baron-Cohen's model suggests that autistics are devoid of interest in others. And that may or may not be what Simon Baron-Cohen wants to suggest, but the fact is that by implication, there is this strong suggestion there that autistics are devoid of interest in others, when again, that obviously varies from autistic to autistic, but as a blanket sweeping, as a blanket sweeping idea, that is just not correct, because it really does depend on the individual, and many autistics are interested in others. Just because you struggle to interact with others and to understand people does not mean you're not interested in them. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to video number 2 to carry on this review. So moving on to video number 2 now.